talk about the secret life of trees. I'm Ranger Jeff. I'm the Chief of Interpretation at San Juan Island National Historical Park. For those that don't know what interpreters are, we don't translate languages. We are storytellers, and it's a perfect fit for me because I've been telling stories my entire life. My mom used to give me a hard time about that, but that's another story. I've been on San Juan for 8 years now, and one of the most special, one of the most incredibly fascinating places that I've ever been. And one of the things that I picked up in this particular job is an interest in trees. I came about it really in an interesting way. About 4 or 5 years ago, I read a book by Richard Powers called The Overstory. Anybody heard of The Overstory? Great book, best book I've ever read. And it got me interested in this topic, and the more I studied it, I said, somebody's going to be interested in this, so I developed this program, and it's kind of evolved from that. And we're fortunate enough to have Peter Wolbein's translator in the front row here. If you don't know who Peter is, he's one of the leading researchers in this area of forest communication, how trees communicate. He's German. Wrote a great book called The Secret Life of Trees, I believe, isn't it?
Life of Trees.
Yeah. Oh, The Hidden Life of Trees. Yeah, there you go. There you go. And I've got a little bibliography at the end of some other stuff that you might be interested in. So, I always like to remind people who I am, right? I'm an interpretive ranger. What that means is I'm not an expert on any given topic, right? What I do is I take a new topic, something that interests me, ideally, and I study it. Usually takes me about 6 or 7 months, and I do this in the off season, right? And then get it ready for spring. 6 or 7 months to research a topic and find out what I need to understand and learn about, and then I give it back to the public in interesting and entertaining ways. So I hope I do that for you tonight. Thanks for being here, I appreciate it. I do have about 8 introductory slides. Kind of sets the stage for, I think, what we all know, and that is that trees are really special. We all have a story associated with trees, right? I'll tell mine in a bit. Trees are a part of who we are, culturally, in film and music. Every venue of life for human beings has ties to trees. I think we all know that in the back of our mind that all along trees have been communicating. I think we probably knew that instinctively, and now for the first time we're starting to see that they actually do communicate. And this is a brand new area of study, I will say. Only started out in 1997, so this is really new stuff, and groundbreaking stuff is happening all the time. So forgive the pun, I am a ranger, let's dig in. Trees are our oldest living companions, right? The oldest living organisms on the planet. Since the dawn of time, trees have been human companions, finding their way into all kinds of corners in human life. They're some of our best metaphors for life. Strong as an oak, tall and silent, giants, right? We all recognize those and we can associate those with trees. But more than metaphorically, they speak a very sophisticated language. It's almost mind-boggling to think about an inanimate object, what we previously thought are inanimate objects, actually communicating with one another and maybe even communicating with us, which is pretty fascinating. Trees are at the very root of our culture and who we are as human beings. The Methuselah tree, right? 5,000 years old. Crazy. The Montezuma cypress in Mexico, between 2,000 and 5,000 years old. The General Sherman tree down in Sequoia Kings Canyon National Park, probably 2,500 to 2,700 years old. So humans have always been inspired by trees. We marvel at their size, at their height, about their age. We study them intently, trying to learn more about them. And sometimes not even knowing why we're doing that. The advance of humans and technology has brought us to this point. Instead of thinking trees as strictly 2x4s, right, or something we can build from or something we can burn from, we're now taking advantage of that relationship I think that trees have always wanted with us. They are cultural symbols. Wishing trees, right? Trees are significant in many ways in all the world's mythologies. They've been given deep and sacred meanings throughout the ages. Human beings have been observing growth and death of trees and the annual death and revival of their foliage, and often associate those as powerful symbols of growth, rebirth, death. In the Buddhist tradition, the banyan tree, right, is a tree that has always existed and will never die. It keeps reinventing itself. Evergreen trees, which are largely stay green throughout the year and through seasonal cycles, are sometimes considered symbols of eternal life or immortality or fertility. The image of a tree of life or a world tree occurs in many mythologies. Examples include the one that I just mentioned, the banyan tree, which is sacred in the Buddhist tradition, the sacred fig in Hinduism, Buddhism and Jainism, the tree of knowledge, the tree of good and evil in Christianity. So trees have found their way into probably every avenue of life in one way or another. Cultural uses of trees. In folk religion and folklore, trees are often said to be homes of tree spirits, right? What was the little sprite, the little Disney sprite? That Tinkerbell, yeah, lived in a tree, right? German mythology as well as Celtic polytheism both appear to have evolved cultic practice in sacred groves, especially oak groves for some reason. The Egyptian Book of the Dead mentions sycamores as part of the scenery where the soul is deceased and finds bliss. I find it odd that we have rooted trees deep within our cultures and given them mystic, sometimes magical qualities, and yet only now are we starting to find out who they really are. And I use that term who not as a metaphor, but in literally. They're deeply rooted in mythology as well. They have been venerated since time immemorial. Many cultures link the lives and fortunes of individuals to trees, using them as oracles. In Greek mythology, for instance, dryads were believed to be shy nymphs who inhabited trees. Trees have their roots in the ground and their trunk and branches extended towards the sky. This concept is found in many cultural practices, in many mythologies of holding up the universe, having the feet planted deep in the ground and holding up the weight of the universe. Democracy started in the United States, in North America, when the great native peacemakers formed the Iroquois Confederacy, and inspiring the warriors of the original 5 American nations to bury their weapons under the sacred tree. And that's how really democracy, so to speak, got started in North America. Trees are iconic in literature. We talked about the overstory, right? But for any Lord of the Rings fans in here, we know there's a bunch of them in there, right? Trees not only serve as important symbols and icons, but they imbue special characteristics such as strength and aging gracefully and stalwart. And these characteristics bestow themselves on those whom are associated in literature with those trees. One of my favorite poems, because sometimes I get to play a blacksmith, a 19th century blacksmith, and I do a poem by Longfellow. You probably remember, under the spreading chestnut tree, the village smithy stands. A tall and sinewy man is he, with broad and arms like bands of steel, something like that. That remains iconic. That picture that we all associated with that poem are iconic. If you're a Tolkien fan, a fan of Lord of the Rings, you'll remember the tree of Gondor sitting in front of the White Citadel. Trees in film. Ewoks, right? We remember those guys in Star Wars. Home trees. Trees have found central roles in films from To Kill a Mockingbird to Avatar, and almost always holding some positive characteristic. Yes, we do see them in horror films, and yes, they are sometimes scary, but almost universally, when one thinks of a tree, we have positive feelings about them. some of the other trees that are in movies that you might have seen, or you might want to go see. Groot in Guardians of the Galaxy, Treebeard in Lord of the Rings, The Two Towers, Toad Tree in Pan's Labyrinth, The Whomping Willow, my kids loved that book. The Possessed Tree in The Evil Dead, I don't watch those, but I take it it's there. The Grandmother Willow in Pocahontas, and my favorite of all time, Agent 13 in Get Smart. If you haven't seen that, you should definitely see it. There's my getting the background out of the way, right? So everybody's convinced now that trees are important and have always been important, and we have some kind of a connection with them, some kind of an interest in them, and that's why you guys are here, right? So how do trees work? Hold up your hand if you could say you have a fairly sophisticated understanding of how a tree works. I didn't either until I started. Pardon me?
Photosynthesis.
Photosynthesis, exactly. That's what I knew, right? That's what I knew. Well, I'm going to tell you stuff about trees that blew my mind when I found out about them. Why are we so interested? And why don't they actually speak to us in some way? That's very frustrating. Now that I know they can, I want to hear them, right? I'll make a leap here and suggest that I think we've known all along that trees communicate in some way. We just haven't been able to hear them. Well, now we're starting to be able to hear them. But before we get to that bit, let's talk about how trees actually work. It's absolutely fascinating. How do trees move water and nutrients, right? This thing called capillary action. Take a paintbrush and put it in some colored water, and you can see it soak up. That's capillary action. That's how trees move water from one place to another, as well as nutrients, right? It flows in a very narrow space in opposition to, or at least without the assistance of external forces like gravity. The effect can be seen in drawing up liquids in a straw. So this is literally how a tree works. Put your straw in a milkshake and pull it up and put your finger on the top. That's how a tree works. That's literally how a tree works. But it's a little more complicated than that, but basically that's how it works. That process is moving water laden with nutrients from the soil and the roots into the xylem and then up to the leaves. And then the phloem, then when I say xylem, it's actually the transport, it's the elevator that takes food and water upstairs right to the leaves. And then you have the phloem, that's the down elevator, two totally different elevators that is moving nutrients from the leaves back into the tree and distributing it as well. I'm going to show you a picture in a little bit. It's absolutely fascinating. So there are the xylem and the phloem, right? You can see the one on the right, see the blue arrows? They're moving stuff up and down, right? Two-way transmission, moving water and nutrients up and down. The phloem, or the xylem, is only moving in one direction, going up. Capillary action is that process. What do you think you're seeing there? Anybody have any idea? That's a burnt tree root, right? That's a burnt tree. It got hit by lightning and it exposed something really fascinating. This is a burl at the bottom of a tree. If you'll look carefully, you can see up at the top of the tree, those lines that are all curlicued down here are going straight up the tree. That's the xylem and the phloem, right? That's the transport mechanism moving things around. It gets all screwed up down here because it got a disease or something happened at that point in the tree's life that it stopped growing up and started growing around itself. That's how a burl is created. But it still has to feed itself, and that's what you're seeing. You're seeing the flow, the transport mechanisms for food and water for a tree. How much water? This absolutely amazes me, right? From this, it's easy to understand why climate change and the drought that it sometimes produces has such a huge impact on a forest, right? So some of this applies only to a single tree, but think of a forest of millions of acres. Think of Yellowstone National Park, 3.2 million acres, and all those trees there, sucking up water every single day. Both healthy and sick and dying trees are soaking up that water as well. So when you have a forest that's under threat from an invasive force, such as pine beetle, which is killing lots of pines in the Sierras and back east as well, or when you get climate change that's driving down the amount of water that's going into forest, both those sick and dying trees continue to consume water. And guess what? You're going to learn in a little bit that the other trees around it are holding off so the other trees can get a drink before they die. Pretty amazing stuff. One of the things that, and this young lady in the front row, being an interpreter for Peter Wolbein, will know this story well. So Peter was walking in this forest. He was charged with taking care of. He was just an average forester, right? He was taking care of a forest, commercial forest, I think. He walked by this same stump every single day. Well, this stump had been dead for at least 100 years, maybe 200 or more years. But he had walked by this tree every single day, this stump. It's covered in moss, covered in green stuff. Well, this particular day, he decided he was going to stop, and he pulled the moss back, and he took out his pocket knife, and he scraped away a little bit of the top. What do you think he found? It's green. Blew him away. How is this tree that's been dead for 150 years continuing to feed itself? It can't photosynthesize. Doesn't make sense. This tree doesn't have leaves, it can't photosynthesize, it can't intake nutrients and water. How is this happening? So what's happening is that the tree and the mechanics that make it work are always trying to fill a void. If you think of trees in that way as transport units and of always trying to take water and nutrients and then get rid of the water and then using the nutrients to create biomass. If you'll look back here, I think I've got it on this slide. Yeah, a single acre of forest land during the course of a growing season can add 4 tons of biomass, but it takes 4,000 tons of water to do that. Right? So forests are incredibly dependent on water sources, obviously. Different parts of the tree take advantage of pressure differences in water and nutrient content in different parts of the tree. Water tends to move to regions where there's negative hydrostatic pressure. I'm going to show you how this works in a little bit. Water uptake by plant root osmosis creates a more negative hydrostatic pressure near the root itself, and then that root then is going towards the less negative pressure. It's going towards the water. That's why you will see a tree who is maybe right next to a parking lot, right? But there's a stream maybe 50 yards away, 25 yards away, however far. And it wants to get its roots to that water. This is what's happening. The roots, there's less pressure to where it's going than where it's at now, and that's how it finds the water. This process called transpiration, this is what moves things up and down the tree. So of all that water that a tree consumes or takes up, it only uses about 0.5% of that water. 1/2 of 1% is used for growth. The rest is evaporated into the atmosphere, right? Through this process called diffusion, where a leaf with high water concentrations, high pressure, releases water into the atmosphere, which has a lower water concentration, lower pressure, right? This process creates negative pressure at the leaf surface and then pulls, just like that straw, pulls everything up. So the water is important to the tree. Of course, it has to have some water to survive. You saw 0.5% of what it uptakes. The rest of that is used in transport. Think of it as a pneumatic, right? These are pneumatics. It's using that water, massive amounts of water, 99.5% of the water that it consumes is used to pull nutrients and water that it needs up to the leaves. Everything else is byproduct. Think of that leaf like the end of a straw. They won't move up until negative pressure is created. How does that negative pressure get created on a leaf? How does that happen, right? Because it can't be receptive all the time. Otherwise, water would be evaporating all the time. So there must be something controlling that. The same thing happens in a tree. Water in the soil filled with nutrients. Through that capillary action, that transpiration is pulled up the tree through the xylem, those little curlicue things that you saw. When negative pressure is created on the leaf surface, a leaf evaporates water into the sunlight, and water evaporates off the leaf surface, literally pulling things up. Here's something interesting that most people did not know. Trees produce oxygen, yes, and consume carbon dioxide, yes? Yeah, when there's light. When there's no light, they release carbon dioxide and consume oxygen, usually at night. Fascinated me, I did not know that. Fortunately, they're better at producing oxygen than they are carbon dioxide. Thank goodness, right? So, what are those mechanics? So this is the stomata, right? This is what makes all of that happen. That's a stomata. That is a stomata. That is that thing under an electron microscope. These are all over the surface of a leaf. If we took a leaf off of that tree, or a leaf from just out the front doors, and we turned it over, we can't see them, but these things cover that entire leaf surface. And those are the things those are the straws, right? Diffusion occurs when there's that high concentration of particles in one place and a lesser in another. Diffusion in which that higher concentrations of particles move into lower concentrations where there are lower concentrations of particles. For example, plants require carbon dioxide in order to carry out the process of photosynthesis. When carbon dioxide builds up in the air surrounding the plant, that gas is able to diffuse through the leaves into the plant. That's how it takes, it's not only releasing oxygen, it's taking up carbon dioxide. So this is literally a little valve that knows when to turn on and when to turn off to photosynthesize, right? The components from absorbed water and carbon dioxide are then used to form glucose, right? Sugar. And we'll talk about a young lady that discovered that trees were releasing sugar and how important that is to this communication thing we're about to talk about. In an environment that has high light intensity, photosynthesis is carried out at a much higher rate, right? That's why you see big, tall trees with lots of big leaves and big canopies down in the Amazon rainforest, right? They're taking advantage of the environment. If you've been in a forest around here, you'll know this well. We have Doug fir forest here, right? Big Doug fir forest everywhere. But on occasion, you'll see a Pacific madrone, right? In an odd spot. What do all those odd spots have in common? Sunlight. It's exactly right. So Doug fir is a pioneer tree. They come up first, they grow really fast, they completely dominate their environment. Well, the Pacific madrone just bides their time, yeah. And then there's a little bit of sunlight hits the floor once they get tall, right? Now he sprouts up. Now his canopy, all of a sudden, he's 10 years old, and all of a sudden his canopy is now clouded over again. He will bend. You will see them bend towards the light, and that's what makes them just fascinating trees to me anyway. So how these work really quickly. So there are these little guard cells that sit on top of the stomata. This is in its closed form, right? When it gets to open, it bends, and that's the opening of the straw. That's what that little thing right there is. That's the opening through which water and nutrients are moving. All right, the stuff you're really interested in. Are trees intelligent? Do they communicate? Do they form communities? Well, I can tell you from personal experience, when I first used to walk into a forest, I used to be an avid hunter, not so much anymore, but I spent my entire life in the woods. And I walk into a forest and I see a bunch of trees, and I always think of them as individuals, right? It's just a bunch of trees, and they don't really have any relationship with one another, except some of the smaller ones probably came from the acorns or the pine cones of the trees around it. And I thought there was, a forest really didn't have a relationship one to another. Boy, was I wrong. They certainly do. The largest organism on the planet is a grove of aspens I believe it's in Colorado. It's the largest living organism on the planet, and it covers, I think, hundreds of acres, if I'm not mistaken. While trees don't have a nervous system or a brain, at least as we understand them, scientists are starting to uncover that trees actually have their own sort of nervous system that's capable of facilitating tree communications, memory, and learning. Trees have analogous structures and a way of talking about consuming sensory data that they gather in their everyday lives, integrate it, and then behave in appropriate ways in response. So we can see a direct correlation between something happening in the forest, we'll talk more about that, and the tree's response to it. But it's not only the tree's response, it's the forest response to whatever's going on. Cells of both plants and animals exhibit electrotransmitters, you and I, right? That's why the little pacemaker works for some people, and it creates that electric pulse that restarts your internal electronics and get everything back in line, right? Well, trees have these same kinds of electric fields as well, where they relay messages between cells. We see that trees are communicating when these cells are firing, when the cells are combining. We see there's electric current flowing, so we know it's happening in the tree. We believe that electricity is also being transmitted outside the tree. This is a brand new area of study, right? This is cutting edge of tree communications, but there are people looking into that particular topic. They don't have a central nervous system like a spinal cord, a brain, and yet the leaves still get the messages from the roots and from the cambium, from the leaves. But if trees don't have brains to collect and process information, from different limbs in the body, how does information get distributed? This is where it gets really wacky, right? So these are two different pictures. One is a tree and one is a human being. Which one's the tree? Any doctors in here? Nurses? You recognize either of those? That's a glial cell. So this is like glue between cells, my understanding and my basic understanding. While this is mycelia, right? Mycelia is stuff that mushrooms grow from. So mycelia covers the entire forest floor just below the leaf structure, right? In spring in particular, if you'll pull back the leaves and you see these little white strands running everywhere, those are mycelia. Mushrooms are the fruit from mycelia, right? So these cells, or these connections through the mycelia, are playing the same role as a central nervous system for a human being. So now we start to extrapolate, right? So we're no longer seeing trees as individuals. Now we have a central nervous system, or at least a stand-in for it, right? I'm not saying that they have a brain. I'm not saying that it's as complex as the human nervous system. But what I'm saying is that mycelia are performing the same function on behalf of a forest that our nervous system performs on behalf of us as individuals. That makes me start to think of a forest as an individual, less a grouping of lots of different kinds of trees. Trees communicate in multiple ways. We've hinted at some of those. They talk to one another through the soil and the air using this vast network of telephone lines, this mycelia. The lines are connected to hubs, mother trees, right? These are old growth trees, the biggest trees in the forest. Why? Why are these hubs? Because they have the most photosynthetic capacity, right? Their mycelial network stretches much, much further. They have a bigger impact on the trees around them than a smaller tree with a smaller mycelial network, not as deep a root system, not as complex a photosynthetic capacities. They talk to each other through the air using smells. Trees can smell. I mean, it blew me away. Enabling them to connect over fairly long distances, right? And we're talking about miles here. Trees also communicate using those electrical signals and even sound. This is all science, guys. This is not me making stuff up. This is not, some quacky ranger creating stuff to entertain people. This is science. They're people that are telling me this stuff. They retain an understanding of these lines and networks across generations. How? How do they do this? The Wood Wide Web. You guys haven't heard of the Wood Wide Web? Your Bluetooth doesn't connect? And if you're in a forest, look at your Bluetooth next time you're in a forest and see if the Wood Wide Web pops up, right? So that's what we call this network of mycelia that's connecting all of these trees, because lots of information is moving through it. They have theorized, dendrologists, tree guys, have theorized that trees live longer because they share resources through the roots. Now we're proving that. Here's how they tested the theory. In 1997, a young biologist from British Columbia, the University of British Columbia, named Susan Simard, discovered that trees release carbohydrates into the ground. It was kind of interesting, but not groundbreaking. I mean, something new. But she got curious. That made her curious. Because not only were carbohydrates being released through the ground through photosynthesis, providing nutrients to the roots, in return, she found that underground microorganisms connect each plant one to another so that these supplements are distributed evenly through a community of trees. It's kind of like a community food bank. They share, particularly trees of the same species. Here's how they figured it out, right? These are smart people, right? Not rangers. They injected carbon dioxide gas, replaced with radio-labeled carbon into the trunk of birch trees, and nearby fir trees were covered, right? So they can't photosynthesize. So you got one tree over here, it's a birch tree. They injected radioisotopes, tracing mechanisms. This doctor probably uses that in his practice, right? To see where stuff goes, help us figure out where stuff goes when it's inside of things. So you injected the birch tree. Then you have this fir tree yards away, and they covered it so it can't photosynthesize, it's not getting any light. They waited a couple of hours, a couple more hours, and then they tested. What do you think they found? They found isotope carbon-14 in the fir tree. This really got her curious, right? This nuclear material is moving between the trees. They're communicating, and at a really rapid rate, in a really short period of time, something is going on. She was fascinated at this point, right? This is where Richard Powers got me when he started talking about this kind of stuff, right? Bacteria and fungi as messengers. So fungi can cover, mushrooms can cover, and the underlying mycelia can cover a large area, developing these white fungal threads known as mycelium, right? Spreads out on the top of tree roots, takes up sugar from the tree, and by providing vital minerals back to the tree, they create a relationship one to another. Nitrogen, phosphorus is something that the tree needs, and it gets it from this mycelia via the root network, right? So think of a forest. Think about in between the trees, there's this mat, this white mat with millions and millions of threads. These threads reach out and they tie into the tips of the roots themselves, and they bind themselves to that root tip. That's the communication mechanism. And the more widespread that mycelial network is, the better the communications. Want to kill a tree? Want to kill a forest? Dig around those trees and break that mycelial network. Now they're all on their own, right? They're no longer living in a community. They're no longer family. They're standing there looking at one another. I wish I could help, but we've cut off their communication mechanism. What would it be like for you if Verizon or T-Mobile or AT&T shut off cell service, right? We'd feel pretty alone, right? How do they pass along this information? We know the mechanism, we know the channel, we know how it's getting there, we know where it's traveling, but how is it moving? So these are those mycelial threads, right? You've probably seen this, right? If you pull back the leaf litter, you will see that. If you see mushrooms sprouting out of the ground, particularly this time of year, you will see lots of mushrooms, right? Just pull back the leaf litter and you'll see this stuff all over the place. Right? For young saplings in a deeply shaded part of the forest, the network is literally a lifeline. Lacking the sunlight to photosynthesize, they survive because big trees, including their parents, pump sugar into their roots through the network. In this way, mother trees suckle their young. These are metaphors that I'm applying, but I don't think it's too big a stretch to see how trees are communicating and sharing with one another. Using DNA sequences and big data analysis, microbiologists have identified different species of fungi and bacteria that form these symbiotic relationships. The one I'm most familiar with is called the Arbucular Mycorrhizal Network, the ABM, right? The Wood Wide Web. But lots of trees have different relationships with different kinds of fungi. Right? Think of it as, some trees use AT&T and some trees use T-Mobile. Think of it in that way, that these bacterial mats, these mycelial mats have relationships with certain kinds of trees, and these trees prefer them, right? Prefer that kind of bacterial, that kind of mycelial relationship. Every tree, scientists theorize that every tree has a mycorrhizal network, but trees communicate with each other using fungal and bacterial species that constitute their mycorrhizal network, that's specific to them. What's one that we saw? We have fir tree and birch tree. They use the arbucular mycorrhizal network, the ABM is their communication portal. Trees prefer their own kind. Not a surprise, right? We all prefer people we know, right? People like us. This behavior is kin recognition, was recently explored when multiple families of Doug fir, we know them well, were planted in a plot, and carbon tracing experience indicated that trees of the same family were sharing and communicating more than they were with trees not in that family or different kinds of trees. They will still share, right? They won't exclusively share with other Dougs, but they prefer to share with Doug fir trees. In this way, they keep their own species going as well. Scientists are still investigating why this is happening. Why? I think we can, I'll take the leap and I will say that for the same reason that human beings and every other animal on the planet has a relationship with others of its kind. We prefer our own kind, and I think that's true of trees as well. Reproductive purposes, right? A pine tree, a Doug fir tree, cannot mate with a white pine tree or a cedar tree. It has to have one of its own type. It's pretty cool. It's not in the presentation, but in the spring, so deciduous trees, hardwood trees, only reproduce about every 3 years, right? Pine trees reproduce every single year, but it's really cool how they do it. The trees talk to one another and they decide, the weather's looking pretty good. I think it's coming pretty soon. Well, nice weather. Yeah, I see it too. And then one day they all wake up, they see the same thing, and the female flower opens and is ready for the pollen. 3 days later, the male gives it pollen that drifts through the tree canopy and fertilizes the female. Sound familiar? Just like every other species on the planet. These metaphors I'm using for a reason to try and give them something of a, what's the word when you're using a metaphor to describe something that's not human but describe it as human? What's that term? Anthropomorphic, yes, thank you. I'm doing that intentionally because I think where this is going to be in 10 years is we're going to understand how complex these trees and these communities actually are. The other thing that I will say is that go into a forest, go into a Weyerhaeuser forest. Nothing wrong with Weyerhaeuser forests, right? They serve a very important purpose for people all over the planet. But go into a natural forest and see the variety of trees, right? See the large variety of age and types of trees. Those are the healthiest forests. If you go into a Doug fir forest that's planted, it's going to be unhealthy, right? It's not, well, let's put it this way, it's not going to be as healthy as a forest with lots of different variety. And I think that's true in the human condition as well. Trees can warn one another via the air. So this is a little experiment down here. How did they figure this out? This is a very basic description of it. You have a little air pump. It's pushing air into a bottle with a bunch of caterpillars and leaves. So those caterpillars are chewing on the leaves, right? What can be happening in a jar with caterpillars eating leaves? And then they push it out the other end, and it creates this volatile airflow. Certain species of fungi can facilitate tree resilience by using this technique called allelopathy, probably pronouncing that wrong, in which chemical signal is sent through the mycorrhizal network and through the air. Trees can warn their neighbors about an invasive predator or something else, a forest fire, or cutting in another part of the forest. Through the air, they are transmitting these allochemicals. Think of them as pheromones, right, that we give off when we're around other people, right? You're probably with your mate, at least in part, because they smell good, right? You wouldn't go out with somebody that didn't smell well. You certainly wouldn't marry them. So these allochemicals are released into the air, sometimes carried by birds and other creatures into other trees, and releasing these into that tree canopy, it's another means of communication for these trees. They warn each other about stress, about forest disturbances, deforestation, forest fires, invasive species, etc. And then the trees that receive those communication, may not be every tree in the forest, trees that receive that communication pass the word to everybody else that they're connected with in that network. And these hubs, these mother trees, these old growth trees are incredibly important because they anchor different parts of the forest. If we had just a young forest, right, it might struggle a little bit more. When you have old growth mother trees, I mentioned it before, their mycorrhizal network, their ability to communicate is much bigger than a smaller tree would be. And so very important to that part of the forest. They're taller, right? They get these allochemicals, these chemicals flowing through the air, they get them sooner than everybody else. And they can warn the rest of the forest that way.
What do they do with it?
What do they do with that information?
Fight off caterpillars or the
Great question. What they will do, a tree that's under stress or a forest that's under stress, Peter, the one I mentioned earlier, Peter Wolbein, going by that stump every day, sees this green. What was happening there, the reason that stump was green, 150 years old, been cut for 150 years, the reason it's still green is because the trees around it are still trying to feed it. Why are they trying to feed it? Because it was a mother tree, right? It was a nurse tree. Other trees were growing out of the old dead roots. And so new trees were shooting up out of the roots. The trees around her were saying, we got to keep her alive. She's creating lots of kin.
To answer your question, what the trees do, if another tree is being eaten by caterpillars and these distress signals are being sent out, the trees in the vicinity will pump, if it's an oak tree, for example, it will pump bitter tannins into its leaves. So by the time the caterpillars arrive, those leaves don't taste so good.
Yeah, that's exactly right. The other ways that they will, so in a forest that's under stress, the healthy trees, if it's a water stress, they're not getting enough water, the other trees will start consuming less water. So the trees, the smaller ones, the ones that are in more danger, can get more water. You'll see in just a little bit that these environmental factors change tree morphology, actually change the physical being of a tree. But this is how trees are responding to these kinds of threats. They get these chemicals through the air, they put out stinky, smelly, bad tasting stuff, so these bugs don't bother them. What are they doing if a forest fire is coming through? I mean, they're stuck, right? They can't do anything, they can't go anywhere. What they can do is take up lots of water and hold it until that fire moves through, and they do. Kind of amazing. Environmental factors affect tree communication and thus impact forests. So I mentioned earlier, you can imagine going into a forest and creating lots of trenches throughout the forest. This is breaking that communication mechanism. They have to rebuild that. We have a real problem with this in San Juan Island National Historical Park. Has everybody been there? Yeah? If you haven't, you should. It's a pretty incredible place. We have these beautiful preserved prairies, even though they're not in their natural state, right? During the pioneer period, they were really mistreated. Lots of stuff was planted in there. So they're just now, 58 years after we made it a park in 1966, these prairies are still trying to recover. That bacterial mat, that layer of soil through which all this communication is occurring is still not fully developed. We had, you probably heard about our foxes, right? Our red foxes that kit every spring. Well, that created quite a stir about 8 years ago, 7 or 8 years ago. There was a photo that went online. A guy took a video of a bald eagle catching a fox with a rabbit in its mouth and took off and then had to drop it. Well, people from all over the world were coming to the park to take pictures. National Geographic, Discovery Magazine, everybody you can think of. And they were walking out in the prairie. At the time, we had no reason to control access to the prairie, right? Because there weren't many people out there. There were a few, but nothing to really do huge damage. But all of a sudden, we had these huge numbers of people, and they were using the same paths. We closed that prairie down 3 years ago, and those paths are still there. That's just to show how long it takes for that soil microbe, that bacterial mat to recover. Only when it's recovered will we get plants back that native shortgrass prairies we usually associate with. Goldenrod or golden paintbrush, right? These are prairie flowers that were once all over the Pacific Northwest. Very, very few now, because we have done so much damage to their habitat. So I'll just get this out of the way, regardless of what anybody else believes. NPS believes that climate change is real and that human beings are the primary cause. Having put that out of the way, whatever is causing it, changes in climate is seen through increased droughts and extreme temperatures may further disrupt biodiversity of the microbes in a forest. So we talked about how important that microbial mat is, that mycorrhizal network is. Changes in the environment will affect that mat. Some mat requires more water than others. How many have been to Yellowstone? Right? So you've seen the bacterial mats. So I used to work in Yellowstone. You've seen the bacterial mats. They're all different colors because there's different kinds of bacteria that reacts to water at different temperatures, right? Well, the same thing happens with this mycorrhizal network. Some of them require lots of water. Some of them are like dry areas. And trees that become dependent on those, when that mycorrhizal network is threatened, begins to dry out, so that particular forest maybe needs a wet mycorrhizal network, that mycorrhizal network begins to dry out, those trees begin suffering a lack of communication, a loss of communication. We see this in the park as well. We see it in the park from a natural cause. We have this thing called the rain shadow effect. When the air moves across those prairies at American Camp and up the side of Mount Finlayson, it wicks all the moisture out of the ground. By the time it gets to the top, it goes right over the top of the hill. Right on that edge, in that transition zone, we have trees that are fighting for water every single year. Sometimes they get too much, sometimes they get too little. So they're always doing this dance. The same thing will happen in a forest if climate begins affecting that mycorrhizal network as well. Think of what climate change is doing. It's increasing drought, which increases tree mortality. As trees die, they create lots of kindling and firewood. Increased drought also increases the likelihood of fire. Fire then uses the kindling, right? It's essentially what it is. And we saw that a forest can produce 4 million tons of biomass in a given season. This is doing this every year. We have the park, the federal government has only been doing controlled burns for like the last decade or so. Before that, we're putting out every fire in the West. Bad for forests because that biomass builds up. And when those fires do occur, the fires are more intense, they move much faster. So instead of burning through a forest, as fire sometimes does, and fire experts like this, when a fire gets in a forest and it's moving really, really quickly, it'll burn the outside and the lower limbs and maybe even some of the tree top as well, but those trees will survive. But when you have lots of biomass, lots of fuel sitting on the ground, it just continues to burn, heats that forest, and kills those trees. So how does a tree respond? We talked about a tree will respond to an environmental factor by taking up less water. It will respond by putting out oleochemicals that tell other trees in the forest something's going on. They produce bitter tannins in the leaves. They do this very quickly, by the way. This is a response that happens in hours. This is not something that takes days or weeks to happen, right? It's a very rapid reaction. So the tree is responding to these kinds of things. But there's some things that it simply can't respond to. It can't respond to not having enough water for very long. They can hold their breath, they can hold their water for a while, but eventually they'll either have to consume water or they'll have to commit suicide, and they will not do that. So what happens when we see climate change? We see a physiological change to the tree itself. The leaf shape and size will change. What does that affect? Why do we care? Well, we don't have to rake as much in the fall. That's good. But the leaves are smaller, less photosynthetic capacity, right? Less photosynthetic capacity, they're creating less biomass. They have a less of an ability to communicate in the rest of the forest. So the forest begins to go quiet, right? This affects the individual tree. It affects that individual forest. Unfortunately, ecosystems are connected. On San Juan, if you didn't know this, if you stand at American Camp in the prairie, you're within a mile of 5 completely different ecosystems: ocean, prairie, sand dunes, conifer forest, and lagoons, all within a 1-mile radius. Absolutely amazing. Come to the park. Because trees are stationary, right? They can't go anywhere. They have to do something. They're always going to try and preserve their own species. Number one, they're going to try and care for their young, just like we do, right? They're going to take up less water so the small ones around can get enough water. But at some point in time, they have to make a decision. They're going to die, because if I die, they're going to die anyway. So they will just go back and continue their normal growth patterns and eventually die. Ecosystems that are connected begin to feel the effects of that. Connected ecosystems have a relationship to one another. Forest to prairie, prairie to lagoons, the sea to the prairies, to the coastal bluffs as well. And then we have geographical changes in an ecosystem. If you read the New York Times a couple of days ago, there was a great photograph. You normally see Africa and you see this big, wide brown belt, right through the middle of Africa. That's the Saharan desert, right? Well, they got a picture a couple days ago and that is now green, right? It's going green. Is that a harbinger of something, to come? Is that going to be normal? We don't know. I can tell you that in the Sierra Nevada in California, that there are entire forests that are dying for want of water. And those forests that are dying are no longer creating moisture, right? So the forests and ecosystems that are downwind are losing the benefit of that moisture in the air. So it has a cascading effect, if you will. Changes in soil microbia affect nutrients. So it is a downward spiral. I've listed them here. Changes in microbia, trees respond by changing their leaf shape or the thickness of the bark, right? It's saying, I'm not going to produce as thick a bark. I'm going to give that up so I can take in more water. Well, it has the offsetting effect that it's less protected from invasives, and it sweats. Trees do breathe just like we do through the stomata, and they have less ability to breathe, or when the bark is thinner. Changes in tree height, shape, bark density would be expected to change, as well as that photosynthetic capacity. Decreases in photosynthetic capacity then decreases carbon absorption and oxygen release, right? One of the biggest, so of all the carbon on the planet, the places where carbon is stored on the planet, most of it is in trees, right? Most of it is in trees. So if those trees lose their ability to consume carbon, to hold carbon, where does it go? It goes into the atmosphere. We know what the effect of carbon is on greenhouse gases, right? Decreases in the number of trees along with their carbon processing capacity has direct effects on the oxygen absorbing life forms on the planet. Who could those be, right? So on the right here, this spiral is the one that I want to draw attention to. So here's the cycle, that death spiral that trees and forests. So we're looking at an individual tree, but we can be talking about forest or ecosystem or regions, the entire Pacific Northwest, for instance, right? So we have trees are planted, naturally or otherwise. Seasonal drought, alleviated by irrigation, is able to overcome that for a while, as well as the trees, controlling their water uptake and release. Mature trees, no management necessary. We're all good. Drought and heat waves exacerbated by climate change now affect how much water they can consume. The government then imposed water sanctions. In California, in the summertime, you can only water on 2 days a week, and everybody rotates depending upon their zip code, I think. Then you have an entire region of stressed trees. You have additional stressors, so people are coming in to cut them. And then you have lots of dead trees. Go into Yosemite Valley. I used to work there, and it used to amaze me. I was there before they started the tree cutting, which only started about 3 years ago. And I could stand at Tunnel View, which is that famous view coming from Fresno on Highway 41. You go down this mile-long tunnel, and then it opens up, and Yosemite Valley is right there, Half Dome's in the distance, right? The waterfalls are all right in front of you. But when I stood up there for the first time, I was with another ranger, and it just blew me away. The number of dead trees, absolutely amazing. What's causing that? Yeah, the pine beetle is doing a lot of it, but changes in temperature and changes in water level is really doing most of that damage in Yosemite. One study has found that certain stress trees and dying trees, kind of like the last hurrah, the last gas, they will pass resources like nitrogen and phosphorus to their neighbors before they die. They got a will and testament. They don't write it down. This gives healthy trees that receive that extra resources a boost in combating whatever disease or whatever threat that is. So they're trying to survive as long as they can. The question then becomes, at what point do these negative effects outweigh the forest's ability to recover? In a lot of forests, we've already reached that point. The Sierra, I think, is one of those. The big unknown may have dramatic and insurmountable impacts on our species, on every oxygen-consuming species on the planet. Want to do a test on this? Everybody hold their breath for 30 seconds. Right? We're not going to do that, but you get the idea, right? You can't go very long without oxygen. So, there are 3 primary species, root species on the planet: archaea, bacteria, and eukarya. Archaea are the first life forms on the planet, 3.7 billion years old. We see them in the fossil records. There was no oxygen at 3.7 billion years ago. So how were they surviving, right? They were breathing methane. They were consuming chemicals, acids that would kill a human being. They were consuming these, and they were producing mass. They were creating more archaea. And they did this for a very long time until one day, 2 archaea showed up at the same place, decided they wanted to do something different. They mated and they produced bacteria, the first bacteria on the planet, right? Bacteria then created oxygen. Oxygen then allowed every other species on the planet to explode, right? When bacteria came around. And then once bacteria had done their thing, we have a nice atmosphere, we have a nice, plenty of oxygen to breathe in the right quantities and the right balance. You and I showed up, eukarya, deer, mouse, whatever are all eukaryotes. These 3 domains of life define us who we are today and will continue to define us forever, right? As far as we know. But what happens if we interrupt that cycle? What if we take out the oxygen producing components in our environment? Maybe we should start listening to plants. They communicate in order to ensure the survival of themselves and others around them, even species that are not like them. They're taking care of one another, creating oxygen, consuming carbon dioxide gas, doing their job. Animals, including humans, are highly dependent on the plant life, not only for their oxygen production, but for food, clothing, shelter. 50% of all drugs are made from plants. Precipitation, 10% of the air moisture comes from plants, from this respiration, right? This breathing. Fuel and energy, most of the energy we consume, even today, even in your electric car, if you don't want to think about it, that's okay. But your electric car is still consuming fossil fuels. That's how that electricity was produced, unless it came off a nuclear power plant. Now imagine a world without plants. I've been in forests my entire life. I cannot imagine not seeing a forest, let alone not being in one. Moreover, I can't imagine a world without oxygen, at least not for very long. What would a world without plants look like? That's what it looked like 3.7 or 2.7 billion years ago, before bacteria came along, before the arrival of plants and trees. Yes, this is hyperbole. I get it, right? We're not going to do this to ourselves in the next 100 years, maybe the next 1,000, I don't know. But how big a stretch is it really to envision a cascading set of events leading to the depletion of oxygen, increases in carbon dioxide, the death of oxygen producing and oxygen consuming life on the planet? I don't know what the planet would look like without plants. I'm just an interpretive ranger at a small national park in the far northwest corners of North America, but I know that I couldn't live without trees and without forest. So, if we're so heavily dependent on plants for our survival, maybe we should figure out how to better listen to what they have to tell us. What can you do? There are some things we all can do, right? Join a tree club like the National Arbor Day Foundation, right? Support people that are investing in forests and helping trees. Volunteer at tree plantings. You have them around here, whether or not you know it or not. Forest Service has volunteers that'll give you a bag of trees and you go up on a hillside and plant trees all day long. It's a good workout, and then the planet gets something out of it, right? Plant trees in your yard. Just order some trees. Plant some trees in your yard. Give a tree as a gift. I did this for all 3 of my children. I gave them a tree when they bought their first house. I said, I want you to plant this in your yard. You won't own this house for your entire lives, but you'll be able to come back around this block and you'll see that tree, right? You'll see that tree in somebody's front or the backyard, unless they're really silly and they cut that thing down. So what can you do? Love a tree. Spend time in a forest. Come see your national parks. Great resources: The Hidden Life of Trees by Peter Wolbein, and the movie The Hidden Life of Trees, 2021. The Secret Life of Trees by Peter Tudge. Finding the Mother Tree by Susan Simard. There's a documentary as well as a great TEDx talk, and it's not very long. You should pull it up. New York Times, The Social Life of Forest, and The Over Story, my favorite, by Richard Powers. If you don't read another book about trees this century, read that one. It's really, really a great book. Thank you very much for coming tonight. I hope you got something out of it and you enjoyed it.